In this lecture, we'll be talking about the medieval Crusades. By this point in European history, and in world history for that matter, Christianity had emerged and grown and matured to such a state in the western part of Europe, and indeed in most of Europe. It had come to the point where people believed that they were Christian by virtue of being a citizen of a particular region, of a particular state. There's nation is not a concept that they would use yet, and yet belonging to a larger kingdom, perhaps the Holy Roman Empire eventually, or the Carolingian Empire. There are some larger empires, and yet people generally also think of things in primarily a local way. And yet we have this concept of Christendom, as it's sometimes called. People are Christian, and I'm using this term historically, less so theologically, but I'll have to untangle some of that as we go through. There's this sense in which all of culture seems to be permeated by Christianity, Christian spirituality. Civic leaders profess faith in Christianity. All of the ministry and the work of the church seems to be everywhere present, and that absolutely shapes the medieval mind. We know that was not the case in the first century or the second century or the third or the fourth or even the fifth or the sixth. But by the time we get to this point, there have been centuries, there have been generations in which people have embraced a form of Christianity that is thoroughly cultural and permeating of society. And it's in this environment that people who profess faith in Christ will take up arms to extend the work of Christ, to extend the accessibility for the people of Christ, as they would consider it, in the East. This whole story begins in the East, and that's an important point. Already we have studied and taken some time to look at the emergence of Islam. We're going to do that a bit more here. But the rise of Islam and Christianity in the East is really the theater in which these things are taking place, even if we often think, and rightly so, of the Crusaders themselves as coming from the West, which they did. As we look at these notes, which I provided for you in PowerPoint form, and they're pretty detailed notes, I would highly encourage you to be looking through them as you study this, as you listen to this lecture. There's a lot there, and I'm not going to go through all of it because I want you to have access to be able to go back through and read carefully, and yet there is a lot there that I want us to look at. As we begin, I have a timeline here for you. If you notice, these are very round numbers. These are numbers representative of broad eras rather than very specific times. And I have this primarily so that you conceive of the big eras that we are studying. Late antiquity, that is the ancient world, the last remnants of the classical and the ancient world, are sort of fading away in the West much earlier than in the East. And by about the year 500, it's pretty much so that the medieval world is settling in and the ancient world is fading away. Now, again, depending on where you are, I've used this number 600 here, primarily because of the East. And in fact, in the East, it's the case that things feel a whole lot more ancient. They feel more classical. The language of Greek is still being used much, much later, perhaps even into the year 700, or perhaps even well into that century. And yet I'm using the number 600 here as a round number. If we get into the early Middle Ages, this is often called the Dark Ages. I'm going to call them the early Middle Ages for reasons that I've already discussed in class, very likely. From this year 600 or so, or perhaps even the year 500, up until the year 1000, this is the early Middle Ages. And this is sort of bumping up right into the era of the Crusades, which are going to be in the 11th century. And then, of course, you've got the High Middle Ages, the cultural high mark of the Middle Ages for Western Europe and the rest from there. I want now to talk about the rise of Islam, because if we don't understand the rise of Islam, none of the Crusades make sense. It just becomes sort of the vague, rhetorical or even polarizing issues that we often might hear discussed in popular culture or in the public square. Again, not without some reason, but we want to understand some of the history behind this. Islam is one of the three world religions, the main monotheistic religions of the world. The others, of course, being Judaism and Christianity. And that's something that's sometimes lost on Westerners, particularly I think in the United States, where again Islam seems like some distant thing. We think of the trials of radical Islam and radicalization in certain parts of the Middle East. We think about 9/11 and things like that. And those are very modern concepts. We need to have a better grasp here on Islamic religion and its origins. And it claims to be a religion of Abraham, Isaac, Moses, David, and even Jesus. Yes, Jesus is mentioned in the Quran, as well as these other figures. They have a different view of Jesus, to be sure. That goes without saying. This is not at all saying that they believe the same things about Jesus or about any of these figures, for that matter, as the Christian Bible does. And yet, they have some connection according to their own words. And so we need to recognize that. I think that's significant. Of course, the religion begins with Muhammad. I think that's well known. Muhammad is born in the 6th century in the year 570. We don't know a lot of Muhammad's background, but we do know some things. He was born near Mecca in Arabia, and he rejected the polytheism of the Arabs. He rejected the religion of the people in which he's living. And this is significant. Christianity does exist in this area, but only in small numbers. In the Arabian Peninsula, there are some Christians, and it seems that Muhammad does encounter some Christians and certainly some Jews, but they're a small minority, and it seems that many of the Christians that he encounters are probably heretics. So they embrace some external form of Christianity, but they have very faulty views that would ultimately put them outside of Orthodox, traditional, classical Christianity. One of the reasons that we know this is that the Christian ideas that he cites in the Quran and in other places are claiming things for Christianity that Christians actually don't hold. And so it seems that he's sadly having some poor examples of what Christianity actually holds, just by virtue of where he is geographically in the Arabian Peninsula. He does also have Jews that are there that he's engaging with, and so on. And there's a whole history of that. But he rejects the polytheism, the paganism, really, of the Arabian peoples, and he faces a great deal of pushback from this. He begins receiving visions at the age of 40. This is the year 610 AD. So really Islam, in terms of its real movement, is a matter of the 7th century in its earliest form. This is when Muhammad is claiming he's receiving these visions, which is the very basis of the Islamic religion. These visions that are given to Muhammad, as he claims here. He claims to receive these pronouncements from an angel, the angel Gabriel. So again, lots of biblical import here, right? It's in many ways drawing on Christian ideas. And as you read through the Quran, if you've never done so, you read through the Quran and you see a whole lot of Christian themes with a twist. It's not all that different from reading the Book of Mormon. Lots of Christian themes with a twist, and very often a significant twist. Very often in Islam, as you read the Quran, it's Christian themes with an absolute turn on them. Christian ideas, Christian doctrines with an absolute sort of revolution on them. He shares these pronouncements, and he's condemned in many instances by his neighbors. He condemns polytheism. He condemns sexual immorality, but again is resisted. He does not immediately have mass numbers of converts in his native town, in his native region. He does eventually have some followers that emerge, and they are ultimately going to be fairly loyal to his message and find him compelling and fascinating, and so they cling to him a little bit, but they're sort of a beleaguered minority there initially. In the year 622, they fled to Medina, and to this day, Medina is a holy city to the Muslim people. Obviously, we know of Mecca, but Medina, secondly, is a very important city in the Islamic faith, and this is where the Muslims begin their calendar. In the year 622, the year that ultimately 622 AD or Common Era is when the Muslims begin their calendar here in Medina. In 628, Muhammad returned and took Mecca by force, and it became the central place of worship for the Muslims in this early era. They burned and destroyed everything associated with the Arabs' ancient religion. It is a cleansing of the paganism that was there. And indeed, these are polytheistic pagans. And so to the Muslims, they ultimately are going to rid them from the area. After Muhammad's death, Islam divides. And those disputes still exist to this day. There is no one Islam today. There are multiple sects. There are two main ones, the Sunni and the Shiite. I won't go into all the detail on that. Those things are easily accessible for you if you want to read on that a little bit more. But ultimately, this comes down to originally an issue of who would be the successor. Muhammad is obviously the guy. Now he's passed. Who will be his successor to lead this religion? Well, from 661 to 732, he conquers, and along with his people, and ultimately those who will come after him, his successors, conquer large areas of what had been the Roman world. They press all the way to the east toward India and into parts of India. They press west all the way across the north of Africa, places that had been Roman colonies, and all the way across the Mediterranean, all the way through Spain, and ultimately will be halted in the very north of Spain, right at the border of France. And this is a fascinating story. These places that had been predominantly Christian are being taken, not overnight, but in a relatively quick succession. These places all across the Middle East, to the west, and ultimately all the way around. And so the Islamic faith was spread by the sword, sometimes by diplomacy, sometimes welcomed by places and by peoples who were not. So there's always some political intrigue going on here. There are some places that are Christian in name and yet have not or have rejected the Catholic faith or the Orthodox faith, the classical expressions of Christianity. And so they themselves feel a bit at odds with the local Christian population. And so they ultimately support the Muslims coming in. So there's some interesting political things going on there. Again, I won't go into all the detail there, but I want you to be aware this is not simply one-dimensional. There's some complexity to it on both sides. This will be true of the Crusades later, as well as Westerners head to the east. As they conquer places, the Muslims will tell people, hey, we'll give you lower taxes and we'll give you freedom if you belong to a monotheistic faith. So paganism, no. Polytheism, no. But if you are monotheistic, if you're Jewish, if you're Christian, there will be some freedom given to you. And so ultimately, there are places where the three will coexist. Muslims, Jews, and Christians. For instance, in Spain, this becomes a place where the three will coexist. Not on equal terms. So to be a Christian in Spain in the Middle Ages, in this first part of the Middle Ages, is to be a second-class citizen, and yet you can practice your faith. You can't proselytize, but you can practice your faith with some immunity. And so even there's some complexity. They are living together, and yet it's not the sort of religious liberty that we would imagine in the modern world, in the United States, for instance. Later in the Middle Ages, the Mongol invasions are going to check the Islamic expansion, and in many ways actually even overturn some of the places that had become Muslim, had been conquered in that way. The Mongols are going to come in. And so again, the Middle Ages is this period of conquering, of conquest, of movement, of political intrigue, and so much there that we could look at. I have a map that shows you the way in which these regions far to the east had belonged to the Eastern Church, not yet divided from the Western Church. That comes in the 11th century, and yet there are some cultural differences here in the church in the East. And so again, as I mentioned previously, this is going to be the context in which the church in the East is going to have to function in large part, in large places, either with Islam pressing at the door or officially and truly under Islamic rule. And the West, less so. The West, in part, there are some places that have fallen. For instance, I mentioned Spain. But for the most part, the West lives with Islam as a bit more of a distant threat in that sense. And to some extent, Western Christians could have dealt with Islam mentally, conceptually, the same way that they would have dealt with other heretics. Because again, the Muslims claim to be monotheistic. They claim to worship a single God. They deny the Trinity for sure. But there's a sense in which they're monotheistic. And so they could deal with them the way that they would deal with other heretics, which had always been a problem for the church, going all the way back to the New Testament, and certainly in the ancient period, right? Well, let's talk about the Crusades a little bit here. As we ultimately think about the Crusades initially beginning and focusing on a little narrow strip of land that we call the Holy Land very often, the land of Israel, sometimes called Palestine, this little narrow strip of land in the Eastern Mediterranean, this is going to be the main place, although it's much broader than this. This is the sort of the heart of the crusading activity. And the Crusades that are going to take place here ultimately really embody some key things that have developed in the Middle Ages. One of them is a militaristic spirit. And not merely a spirit. I should even emphasize, yes, there's a militaristic spirit, but militaristic culture in which people are fighting, in which people are quite willing to mount, to raid, to attack. The Middle Ages is a rough place, a rough time. Medieval Europe is a rough place, is really, I guess, the best way that I would want to say it. And so there's a ruthlessness of this era. And it's not merely a thing going on in the Christian West. It's true in the East as well. It's true among the Muslims. I just told you how willingly they would work through an area and conquer. And by conquest, we're talking about the sword. And so this is a violent and a ruthless era. And so that's embodied here in the Crusades that will eventually come from professing Christians. But another thing is medieval piety. There's a lot of things going on here that are going to be a part of this. Part of it is the theology and the spirituality of indulgences, among other things going on with, eventually we'll get into this a little bit more, but a lot going on here related to medieval piety, pilgrimages and relics and so on. And there's a great bravery. You have all of these knights, as we would call them. You have a whole culture of warfare. You have a ruthlessness. You have piety, and eventually the encouragement of the church itself in the West. And so we have a recipe ultimately in all of these things in this mix for the Crusades. Christopher Columbus, much later, is going to think, of course we know 1492, right? Christopher Columbus, when he sailed the ocean blue. Well, that itself is still in the very late Middle Ages, much later than the period that we're talking about, by about 4.5 centuries, or about 4 centuries or so. And yet, I bring up Christopher Columbus to say there was such a legacy of the Crusades that even in that period of the late 15th century, Christopher Columbus could say that with the wealth that he would bring from the New World, he would lead a new crusade, a crusade to go back to Palestine, to take the Holy Land for Christian possession. So this spirit of the Crusades lives on for a very long time. It's lost on us in modern America, and yet in late medieval period, and actually as we get much later into European history, the Crusades are still very much a part of historic memory, cultural memory. Much more that could be said about this, but to Muslims, this is still a fresh thing. They don't think of the Crusades as something merely that happened in a history book very long ago by strange people who wore metal and rode big horses. To them, it very much feels current, or at the very least, I would say it feels relevant still. And if you speak to a Muslim and you bring up this topic, you'll sense that there's still a sort of a soreness there. Muslims still would consider the establishment of the nation of Israel in 1948 to be a continuation of the Crusades. Again, you have people coming from the West, at least in part, and establishing a civil government there in a place that Muslims had occupied for, by that time, a long time. And so they still, even that, sort of rings familiar as we think about the Crusades. So let's talk about the First Crusade. In 1095, Pope Urban II, the Pope is the Bishop of Rome. Obviously, by this point, is more than just one of the bishops, but is already claiming to be the Vicar of Christ, to have the seat of St. Peter, and etc. So this is the medieval Pope that we think of, Pope Urban II, in the very, very end of the 11th century. He proclaims a religious war. The East is reaching out to the West and to the Bishop of Rome, to the Pope, and saying, come help us. The Muslims are knocking on our door. We're going to fall. The city of Constantinople is going to fall. Byzantine areas are going to fall if you don't come and help us. So bring all that militaristic energy that you have, bring your fresh numbers that you have, and come help us, or else Christendom will be lost in the East. Now, if you notice that, look at the time. By this point, we are already talking post the Great Division between East and West, the Great Schism. And so this illustrates a couple things. Number one, it's not as if East and West are no longer in dialogue. It's not as if they're completely torn asunder. But it also illustrates that you really do have two kind of functioning churches, church capital C, these big, large institutional gatherings of Christians East and West. And so the Pope is going to call this religious war what he's going to call a holy war, essentially. And he's going to sort of try to take up this energy of religious or of European people who are beating each other up and killing each other. You have all these nobles that are running around and doing what knights do. Some of it obviously sensationalized and romanticized in film, but I think we probably get some of it. And ultimately they're going to want to send them over to fight the Muslims, the actual enemies. Stop fighting among yourselves. Let's go to the east and fight there where the real enemies are. So thousands gathered and proclaim eternal rewards for all crusaders. For anyone who will take up cause to go to the east to fight the Muslims, there will be eternal reward. Now, he's a little vague on the details. So, okay, Pope, you're saying that you're going to get, there's eternal rewards for us. What kind of rewards? He's like, just go, you'll figure it out. Eternal rewards, go do your thing. It's a little bit vague initially. But the Crusaders are thinking that they can escape purgatory, which is a doctrine that is developing at this time in the Middle Ages. Even there's some vagueness even on the doctrine of purgatory, potentially still at this period. But sure enough, it's the idea that you can go straight to heaven rather than having to go through a period of purgation of your sins. This very uncomfortable middle ground between hell and heaven. Purgatory is your way to heaven. If you're familiar with Dante's Inferno, it's this dynamic. And he encourages them, the Pope encourages them to wear the red, the sign of the cross taken as sort of a token of Christ's blessing on their crusade. In general, the Crusades, it might be a surprise to you, were in large part a French affair. The French were the foremost people ultimately going west. And so you think about that, going from France all the way to the east. This is it's not as if it's the Austrians or even the northern Italians that are going, but all the way from over in France, what had been classically the land of Gaul. They're going to be going and in large part are leading the efforts and making up a large part of the numbers of the Crusaders that are going to the east. Oftentimes, the Muslims in the east would simply refer to the Crusaders as Franks. And the Franks are occupying the land of France. It's part of where the word French comes from, related to Frank. In 1096, the soldiers took the field against the Muslim rulers, and they crossed through Bulgaria. There are all kinds of conflicts. The Bulgarians are not happy to have these people from way far Western Europe, although Bulgaria is sort of in the west, so to speak. But even there's some conflicts. Again, we think of this big idea of Christendom, and yet it's not as if everyone is on the same page. Let me just say, large numbers of people die just on the way getting to Palestine to crusade. Large numbers of people, both because of violence, because of war itself, but also disease and so many things. This was a very bloody and deadly affair. The Franks already, from the very beginning, have tension with the Byzantines who had called them out. These are the Eastern Christians, the Greek-speaking Orthodox Christians, as we eventually call them later, Orthodox with a capital O. And they distrust the Byzantines, and they're like, we're going to go do this yourself. Hey, Byzantines, thanks for calling us, but we've got this. You guys just kind of get out of the way. Apparently you couldn't handle your stuff. Let us handle it. And although it's not without some setbacks, these Westerners do conquer some significant cities as they're pressing toward Palestine. They conquer Nicaea in Turkey. They conquer Antioch. They conquer Edessa. And in 1099, they conquer the city of Jerusalem. And it's a very difficult siege. The very last year of the 11th century, they conquer the city of Jerusalem, but with great difficulty. In part because anytime you're conquering an area that is besieged, that ultimately has a defensive advantage, it can be quite bloody, and in this case it was very bloody. They brutally kill the inhabitants as the Franks come in. They record that they're in blood just flowing down the street, blood up to their ankles. Extremely, extremely bloody. And this was not unusual for siege warfare, though. There's this sense in which if you fail to surrender, if you're unwilling to surrender, you're basically owning up to the fact that if you lose, if they come through, that they'll slaughter everybody and everything. And so they do. It's extremely bloody. It's kind of it's something near annihilation. And the interesting thing, though, again, just reminding of how bloody this period was. This is what warfare looked like very often in this period. There were no rules of war. Okay, this was before the Geneva Convention. This was a very brutal era. And no one, Muslims or others, are shocked at this. Again, this is part of war in this period. In fact, strangely, we're shocked to find out that some, we shouldn't be if we know medieval warfare, but we're shocked to find out oftentimes as Westerners that there were some Muslims that would rather have had these people come from the West and take over because they weren't so happy with the Muslim overlords. In the same way that some ancient Christians, even if they were often heretical Christians, were actually okay with the Muslims coming through because they weren't exactly happy with the Catholic Church or whatever it is. Again, there's all kinds of interesting political things going on. There are all kinds of signs of Frankish industry that are still there that can be seen in Israel and in Jordan, Syria, Lebanon. Castles are still there. You can go and see really what are medieval castles, but not in France, not in England, but in the Middle East. It's fascinating. If there had been a united Muslim response, the Muslims could have easily wiped out the Crusaders. Their numbers are far smaller. Remember, the Crusaders are on this very tenuous line coming in there from a very, very long distance, and they're able to take these cities piecemeal. But if the Muslims had been more united, and they weren't, that's the thing, is you have all kinds of, yes, we're talking about Islam and Muslims in this broad way, but there's lots of little kingdoms that are also in the same way, sort of in friction with each other. Had they united, they could have easily wiped out the Crusaders. There are subsequent crusades. I'm not going to go through all of this, but in the year 1144, Edessa falls to the Muslims, and there's a launching of a second crusade. And so that's sort of why there's these subsequent waves of crusades, is ultimately lands will ultimately be restored to Muslim rule, and the Westerners at times are able to and willing to sort of mount a unit to go and ultimately kind of retake that city or retake that broader area. In 1187, Jerusalem falls to Saladin, the Sultan of Egypt. He comes up from the south and ultimately conquers. The third crusade sets out to free Jerusalem from Saladin. And by the way, Saladin is still a great hero to the jihadists today, as someone who ultimately goes and conquers the infidels. And so that this is still a name that has currency, particularly among radicalized Muslims. The Fourth Crusade is probably the most famous. It's got Richard the Lionheart and many of the sort of iconic heroes that we think of. Frederick Barbarossa, Philip II, King of France. Frederick sadly drowns. He's, again, in this big, heavy armor, comes out of his ship, coming to shore, but apparently the water is deeper than he thought. And imagine trying to swim with all that armor on, and he drowns. So, I mean, there's all kinds of interesting, strange stories in this. Philip II eventually abandons the crusade. So there's a lot going on in subsequent crusades. The Fourth Crusade was out of disappointment with the previous ones. Sets out to conquer Saladin and almost succeeds, but ultimately is not successful. The Crusaders instead, on their way home, take Constantinople. So they can't beat the Muslims. They're losing ground in their Crusader states, which is exactly what they are. They're colonizing these small states, these Crusader states, as we call them. And so they sack Constantinople. Their ally, their Christian Eastern brothers and sisters, they sack the city of Constantinople, which just absolutely baffling, boggles the mind. And they set up a Latin sort of Crusader state in Constantinople, which stands for really a couple of generations throughout the 13th century. This is bizarre stuff. You can't make this up. They forcibly reunite Eastern and Western Christendom, and that's going back to, again, there's been a division. They say, oh, we're going to fix this whole thing now that we're here, now that we're taking over, and ultimately that's sort of the bizarre thing that's going on here. It only lasts for a short time, but if relations between the East and West were already pretty tense, can you imagine what it's like at this point? Well, there are other crusades. One of them is called the Children's Crusade, which is in the year 1212, so early in the 13th century. This is also a bizarre story. It's not a myth. It's often told. Well, the fact is we don't know a whole lot about it. Our sources on it are kind of thin. But it's a bunch of children. There's such a crusading spirit. Again, think about the spiritual promises that are made to people who would crusade, and ultimately these crusaders, these young children, are marching off to the east thinking they're going to get indulgences, thinking that God is going to bless them, and many of them ultimately are actually taken to become slaves in other parts of Europe. It's a bizarre time. Well, the subsequent influences of the crusade really go deep. I mean, for 200 years, in some areas, there are crusader states in the Middle East. That's 2 centuries. That's a long time. Now, on one hand, it's not an incredibly long time, but 2 centuries. Long enough to have an impact, for sure. There are other crusader states that are going to exist even into the time of the Protestant Reformation in the 16th century in places like Greece. Really what the Crusaders are doing is they're making war serve religion. They're seeking to spread Christianity, not by the proclamation of the gospel, but with a sword, in the same way that Muslims had in the 7th century. We have new monastic orders that are started here, and military orders. A lot going on in terms of medieval spirituality and piety. And I won't go into all this, but relics and indulgences and all kinds of things going on. There are also some interesting things intellectually that result from this. One of them is the increase in trade. There are things in the East, both goods and knowledge, that have been lost to the West because of this dynamic that we've described sometimes as the Dark Ages. There is a loss of knowledge in the West in many places, and those things are restored. For instance, Aristotle, as well as mathematical texts and so on. There's some interesting things, just honestly, certain elements of the Greek language itself that have been so lost in the West and are restored in this period through the Crusader states. And this has some important import as we get later into the Scholastic era and so on. So hang on to that. We'll come back to some of this here. The last thing I want to say is just in terms of the way we frame this up in talking about the Crusades. I want to say that as a Christian, as someone seeking to follow Jesus, as a Christ follower, as a biblical Christian, a Christian that seeks to follow a suffering servant, a Lord who died on the cross to pay for our sins, I don't at all want to associate my faith, and we shouldn't. My word to you is that you shouldn't associate your faith with a sort of crusading spirit in this way, meaning that we shouldn't be thinking, as we read this, as we study this, we should be cautious in our own hearts and minds that we not see this, for instance, in the way that Muslims would see it and the way that some triumphant Christians would want to see it, as sort of Christianity versus Islam. Because theologically that has significant problems. Really what we have here is people professing Christ, in many ways, primarily in just a cultural and civil way, and people who are Muslim, although, again, we're not talking about a united Islam. We're talking about people who happen to be Muslim and belong to one of the many Muslim kingdoms of the era, and they are in conflict together. It is a history that we need to know well. It's something that we need to reckon with. It's something that we need to acknowledge. There's a lot here in terms of a bad example of medieval Christianity. And yet, as a Christian, we should in many ways want to condemn the actions of those who think that they can spread the faith with a sword. And much more that could be said about this, but as important as this era is, there's also some sort of untangling, I think, that we probably have to do theologically. It is something that has happened and needs to be acknowledged. And yet Christ has called us to proclaim the gospel and to, if necessary, lay down our lives for the gospel, but not as military heroes, not as warriors, but rather as servants, rather as the apostles did, not raising a sword, but rather speaking the truth of Jesus Christ and the gospel. So as we study the Crusades, I hope this has been helpful. Much, much more that we could study. We're barely scratching the surface here. This era of the Crusades in the Middle Ages is fascinating, and I hope you're enjoying it.